I'm Shelby Eletmani, and this is EF Outbound, a podcast that showcases transformative travel stories that defy our expectations, challenge our assumptions, and teach us something new about the world and ourselves. Okay, well, we can get into that story of what happened in Bangkok.
That sounds like a great title for a chapter of like a spy novel. Like
what happened in Bangkok?
What happened in Bangkok? I wound up running into this Sikh guy, this Indian Sikh guy. We had a couple of drinks and then he was like, "Do you want to go for a ride on my motorbike?" And then we like went on his motorbike and we were riding, and I remember there was a storm coming. That was like a big moment of like, what am I doing? It's 2 a.m. in Bangkok. No one knows where I am. Like, possibly no one but my mother is thinking where I am in the States. And it was like one of those first moments where I'm like, I could be doing anything right now.
That's Jack. And no, this isn't a spy story. But today, Jack will tell us how a serendipitous stop on a trip to Bangkok totally changed the course of his life, and how intentionally putting himself in new places with new people and new ideas was the key to discovering his true passion. But before Bangkok, Jack was on the path to a life in politics.
I've been pretty political for most of my life. I mean, I came out of the closet pretty early, and that was sort of politicized me because I was from a really conservative town in Illinois. And so I was always aware of like being like a little bit of an outsider, and I've always had like a provocative personality, so nothing is more provocative than being a far left gay kid in a conservative town. And plus my parents were fairly political and well versed in current events and what was going on in the world. So they didn't like push me, but it was like suggested that like I take a look at like politics and law and sort of social studies-esque stuff. I was really planning when I graduated to pursue postgraduate work in like political theory and on like stuff related to China or Middle East studies.
But Jack's sights weren't set on the White House or Capitol Hill. His interest was focused on education and the historical narratives people are taught through school. Sort of like how some people are taught that African slaves were immigrants to America, while others are taught that they were in fact brought to the States against their will and sold. On top of that, he was interested in how education systems represent different groups of people.
I guess I had like some shishi-fufu idea of myself like studying at Oxford and maybe going to work for a think tank or something like that, but they were relatively like vague plans.
But right after college, Jack was beginning to feel a bit restless and cloistered in the academic world. And in New York.
I was kind of in the midst of sort of recalibrating like views about myself and my own place in the world. None of my friends or like any of the people I really associated with had this sort of global view of themselves. Like their view of the world really expanded no further than a couple states. I wanted to like not do that. I had come to a certain point living in the US where like I just needed to get out and do something else.
So he started looking for something else. Something that would help him define his path to political life, but also something that would just let him get away and try something new. He started looking for teaching opportunities in China.
A lot of my research work was on the education system in China. So I really didn't have that hard of a time finding a job because I was more than a little bit of an expert on their education system.
Sure enough, Jack got a job at a university in Chongqing, China.
I joked with a friend, really like China was like a good chance to put myself in like a different situation and see how I acted and see if I could like carry those ideals that I learned my final year of undergraduate education to a different context. But also in another sense, it was like a little bit running away. The very first night we had a dinner, and we had a dinner with the president of the university, and I was so nervous I couldn't hold my chopsticks. And it was like super, super embarrassing because I've got like a big personality and I'm smart and well-read and cultured, and I'm like very used to being like the big person in the room. And to like walk in the room and like be at the bottom of the food chain was very disorienting. I don't really recall much of actually what occurred that first semester because it was just all kind of like this giant blur, trying to get things done and trying to acclimate myself to where I was living. New social customs, new work customs, like having to deal with students, having to learn all the students' names, having to learn the culture of the university. And I really didn't have time to like really think about what I was sort of doing or how I was sort of feeling. And then I was like also rushing to complete grad school applications.
Jack applied to programs at the London School of Economics and, of course, Oxford. But as the semester went on, he noticed more and more that his ideologies were sort of at odds with his reality, and implementing the changes he had hoped was nearly impossible.
I was getting pretty disillusioned by the end of my first semester. It was kind of like a really uphill battle. A really, really uphill battle, and it was like fighting fire with like a squirt gun. And that's when I was sort of thinking, I'm like, is like traditional politics, traditional like political social policy, like the best way to go about affecting like change in the things that I was interested in, which was, you know, representation and narrative and like structures of thinking.
And just as his political beliefs seemed to be unraveling, more bad news. He was rejected by the London School of Economics and Oxford.
It was like a horrific. I remember walking around my apartment being like, what do I do now? I had been working so hard to that point and really trying to like calibrate my life to that point. And then I was kind of like, maybe it's not worth it. I was like gently pushed by my parents to do it, and I was like, maybe my parents made me do it. Maybe I'm just trying to impress friends by trying to do it. So it was like a real moment of like, do I really want this?
So it's kind of all those things compounded, not necessarily like, oh, that was my dream. Like I had to go.
Yeah, I mean, it was my dream and like I had to go, but it was like it was like a million other aspects played into it as well.
It was January. Jack was between semesters, and Chongqing was in the throes of a particularly brutal winter.
My classes had ended a week early, and so I remember sitting around watching a lot of Netflix and drinking a lot of gin, mostly to keep warm. Not because I remember being like, not because I'm sad about those graduate school letters, but because it was so cold. I mean, it was literally the coldest I've ever been in my life, and my heater wasn't working, and like no one wanted to go outside. And I just like sat in my room like drinking gin and watching like BBC crime shows. It was like a pretty dour. I mean, I really enjoyed those like 4 days of doing nothing, drinking gin and like marathoning shows. But it was also like a pretty like dour time. The weather was just like my mood.
Luckily, Jack had a plan. He had scheduled a solo trip through Southeast Asia for the break.
I had planned to do a trip to Bangkok, and then I was going to work at an orphanage in Cambodia, and then I was going to go to Saigon or Ho Chi Minh City. If you travel with other people, like they have stuff they want to do, they don't want to do the stuff you want to do. you're like socially obligated to like try to find a compromise, or you think you're socially obligated to try to find a compromise. So it was just kind of like I had no desire to. I just kind of wanted to drift. The day I flew to Bangkok was like so incredibly cold. I remember just like getting into a cab with one of my students and like the student literally like huddling into me for warmth. So it was really, really good to get out of China. So I get to Bangkok and it's so warm. So like, you know when a place is warm and it feels warm and it looks warm? So I was sweating. I was rank. I was very gamey. I kind of felt like a character in a Graham Greene novel, a little bit. Like nocturnally coming into a city. So I showered, I like shaved. That shower was the best shower I've ever taken in my entire life. In China, my shower was broken and my bath was broken, so I always had to bathe myself with a kettle of hot water. Because every time they came to fix my shower in China, they just flood my bathroom, so after a while I stopped asking them to. So that was like my first real shower in like months. It was like glorious.
Jack headed down to the hostel's bar that night and met some other travelers.
There was like a group of people like drinking beers. I kind of like wandered over and they're like, come drink beers with us. It was like we were all kind of just like lounging about, asking, like, where are you from, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
He met a British man who offered to show him around the city and how to use the subway system the following day.
And we had a very nice day, but it was like kind of like we didn't really hit it off too much. It's always like that Blanche Dubois thing, like always rely on the kindness of strangers. It sucks like the first day in a country to like have to go around by yourself because so much of the time is spent learning how to get around, and to like have someone help me get around like greatly improved my chances of like surviving the next day.
That next day, Jack would do far more than just survive. He met two fellow solo travelers who he affectionately calls the South African girl and the Danish kid.
I was eating breakfast, just planning out my day, like eating breakfast, like looking at the map, circling what I was going to visit. And then the South African girl trundled over and she was like, can I sit here? We got to talking and she very jokingly was like, will you be my protector for the day? And I was like, yes, me lady. And then the Danish kid shows up, like jolly and Danish and young and rosy cheeked and bright eyed. He's like, hi guys. Kind of, he had this like really cute, boyish voice. So he like came over, he's like, can I like sit here and eat with you? And so he started talking. He was the one that really got the three of us talking, and he was like, oh, you know how to get around? Like, do you mind if I follow you around for the day? And so that's how we got that little triumvirate. We took a tuk-tuk. We decided to take like one of those like little taxis driven by a guy on like a motorcycle. It was like open air taxis, which was like really, really fun. And this guy like offered to like give us a deal, and we like hassled with him in the way that the guide taught me to like hassle with him. And it was just a really like fun day, like going from spot to spot to spot. Like that's what the kind of day was. We just went from like place to place to place. And I learned like the South African girl was a fashion design student who was trying to get into modeling. And like the Danish kid, his friend had died. And he was like traveling the world in memory of his friend, which I remember being like, people don't do that. Like that's the plot of a movie. And he was like, no, it's true. He was like traveling for like 12 months. Insane. And he was like, oh yes, in Denmark, that's what people do. And I was just like, all right, I'll take your word for it, man. So it started to rain. So we went to the Bangkok Contemporary Art Museum. That's when I noticed out of the corner of my eye they were playing some movies. And so I went over and I read the little blurbs about the movies, and then I was like, hey, I want to see this. And it was getting late, and they were like, hey, we're going to go home. And I was like, okay, I'm going to hang out here for a little bit. I remember it being really cold. Really, really cold. I remember I wore loafers that day. It was cold, but my feet were sweating. It was cold sweat. And I remember it was I was I might get sick. Because I had been sick in China a little bit because of the climate, the change in climate. And I was like, oh God, I hope I don't get sick. Which was kind of an interesting feeling to have watching the movie, because the movie kind of makes you feel a little dizzy and feverish.
The film was called Tropical Malady by Thai filmmaker Apichatpong Weerasethakul.
When it came out in America, the tagline for it was love is a malady without a cure. So it was interesting that I was oh my God, I might get a little sick. And then I was watching the movie, and I was oh, this movie's kind of about sickness. In the opening scene, there's a bunch of these soldiers, and they're picking up a dead body in the forest, and it's kind of this woozy documentary camera, and they're on the radio with one of the radio girls back at their army station, and then she turns on a pop song for them as they're walking through the forest, but it cuts away as the pop song starts, and it starts to travel through the grass as the pop song plays, and then you get your first glimpse of the monster that's going to come up in the second part of the movie, but you don't know what you're watching at the time. And that feeling only exponentially increased throughout the rest of the movie. So the first half is this love story between a soldier and a country boy. There was something so young and playful and romantic and physical about how they portrayed the interactions between the two guys in the movie that was very, very striking for me. So the idea of the second half of the movie is the country boy from the first part turns into a demonic tiger shaman. And I really can't describe to you the sequence of events that leads up to the final confrontation, but let's just say there's a magical moment of this tree burst out, and what you think first is flame, but it's all these fireflies coming out of the tree, and all the fireflies are playing these little radio broadcasts, which you realize are lines from the first part of the movie. And the soldiers crawling through these thicket of trees, and it's a reference to a scene in the first half of the movie, and he comes out into this clearing, and he's sick, and he's malarial, and he's terrified, and then you notice there's something in the tree above him, and then he clicks on his flashlight, and it's the tiger. They have a real life tiger standing on the tree branch above this guy, and then the soldier's I love you, I'll let you consume me. The tiger doesn't speak, but the trees are speaking for the tiger, and it's I miss you, soldier. And then the soldier's every drop of my blood sings our song, and then it the final shot is the shot of the trees, and then it cuts to black. When it cuts to black, and I'm just sitting there, and I'm what? It's so bonkers, but it was one of those things where I got it. Seeing things represented on screen that I had felt before, but I didn't have a name for. It got something about queerness or gayness for me that I had never seen represented on screen, but that like I knew existed. And so it was the first time for me that there was like, I had seen a work of art that was so primal and personal and emotional, while also still getting at questions of like form and aesthetics and sort of the politics of aesthetics and like how do we tell stories, how do we represent stuff, which was like my interest in politics. So I left and was like, I would like to do something like that. Actually, I said, I will die really unhappy if I don't make something like that. I remember I like walked back from the museum back to my hostel. And I remember I was just like in my eyesight, it was like everything like looked like a shot from the movie. Kind of. And it was like one of those movies that really like changed the way like I look at stuff. So I like went back to that hostel that night and I'm like, I just saw some weird movie. I remember like playing down the movie while in my head being like, oh my God, I'm still thinking about it.
Jack was inspired, but confused. He loved politics, but at the same time, he had never been so moved by a work of art. He was living in a cinematic dreamscape, trying to figure out what to do next. So, that night, he ventured back out into the city.
So I went out to a bar, and then I wound up running into this Sikh guy. We had a couple of drinks, and then he was like, "Do you want to go for a ride on my motorbike?" Which, like, in Tropical Malady, there's a whole scene of like riding on motorbikes. So I guess I was being really like romantic, and I was like, "Yeah, take me on your motorbike." And then we like went on his motorbike and we were riding, and I remember there was another storm coming. And I remember that was like a big moment of like, what am I doing? It's 2 a.m. in Bangkok. No one knows where I am. Possibly no one but my mother is thinking where I am in the States. And it was like one of those like first moments where I'm like, I could be doing anything right now. I can really be doing anything, and like no one is expecting me to do stuff. And the next day, I opened my laptop to check my email. And wouldn't you know, there was an email from Brooklyn College being like, hey, have you thought about applying for our MFA in film? And I was just kind of like, what? I'm like, I don't believe this. And then I was like, I gotta do it.
Jack continued his trip through Cambodia and Vietnam, but he still couldn't stop thinking about the movie or about making movies himself.
When I got back to China, I started writing scripts, and, you know, stuff just like really poured out, like a lot of stuff. I remember the treatment I used to get into film school. I basically took that one of the Thai filmmaker who I really liked, one of his movies, and I just kind of adapted the plot to like America, kind of. And I sent it in and I like got it, and it was so weird because I had never thought, like, film wasn't on my radar.
Jack found his calling just when things seemed to be falling apart. And now, he's finishing up his first year of film school at Brooklyn College. And he credits his newfound passion to his drive to travel and experience the world for himself.
Traveling alone and, like, just, like, the chance to, like, put yourself in a different context and see if you're the same in environments you're used to, or if you like act differently, I think was really important. And I found myself acting in a way I wanted to act when I was abroad, which is why I wanted to go abroad. So that's why I think like traveling is good, and that's why I think traveling alone is even better, because it's just you and you're like really relying on no one. So like if I hadn't like been in Bangkok if I hadn't met those kids on that day, if it hadn't been raining, if I hadn't turned around and like saw the director's name on a wall, if they hadn't been playing that movie at that time, if I hadn't gone on that motorbike with that kid and like had really like thought that sense of freedom and that sense of like, wow, I could really do anything, I like probably wouldn't be doing film right now.
EF Outbound is brought to you by EF Education First, the world leader in international education. This episode was hosted and produced by Shelby Eletmani, with help from Meg Martineau and Tucker Hamilton. It was sound designed by me, Billy Woraznik. For more information on the podcast, head over to ef.com/podcast. And if you like what you hear, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to share your own transformative travel story, email us at outbound@ef.com.